Dig the Spurs Deep by Peter Field. Chapter 1. It was crowding midnight when the thin blade of the chill of the September moon peeped out through a scatter of black clouds to reveal a trim, roan saddle horse wearily threading through the brush, not far from the Lazy Mare Ranch headquarters in southern Colorado. Reaching the open ranch yard at last, the bronc quickened its pace and, with the instinct of a homing bird, made straight for the corrals. In silence, Pat Stevens slid lithely to the ground, stripped off the sweat-stained hull, and lifted it to a peg in the adjacent saddle shed. Swinging the gate, then, he slapped the drooping horse on the flank and watched it shamble into the corral where water and feed was awaiting. As he turned towards the house, Stephen's broad, straight back and easy stride betrayed nothing of his own tiredness after a grueling day in the hills. Habitual, keen-eyed alertness, even at this late hour, stamped him as still a young man, hard, affectionate, and unemotional. There was nothing about the silent ranch yard or its sleeping buildings familiar to Pat as his pockets to arouse suspicion. Usually, when he was away till a late hour, it was true that Crusty Hodge, his aged, grouchy handyman, left a lantern burning in the kitchen, its wick turned low. Either Crusty had forgotten it tonight, or the oil had run out. Stevens made no unnecessary noise as he mounted the steps and crossed the narrow board porch to the door. Despite his precautions, he expected nothing unusual tonight. A grunt of surprise retched out of him as, stepping into the pitch-dark kitchen, he felt abruptly the rough grab of a running noose, descending unseen over his head, pinning his arms to his sides as effectual as a vice. "Hold it, hombre, right where you stand," rasped a gruff voice. Hauled forward a step with a sharp tug of the rope, Pat was unable instantly to brace down the vague familiarity he had sensed in the words. As he braced himself tight, his quick ear caught the scrape of a match, and a moment later the lamp on the table bloomed into light. Pat found himself staring into the scowling round face of his squat, bow-legged friend, Sam Salone. Six gun in one hand and the rope firmly anchored in the other, Sam stared for a brief space with no break in his stern severity, as if unable to credit his eyes, and then he relaxed. "Oh, it's you, huh?" he growled. "What in time you been keeping yourself till this ungodly hour, Stevens?" Disgusted, Pat twitched the rope free and flipped it off. He ignored the question, his own voice grating. "You might have favored me with an explanation of why you're hanging around my house, all primed and cocked with this sort of reception." Despite his notable lack of warmth, Salone grinned back at him, snaggle-teeth showing in a rudimentary, cheerful face. "Well, that's easy," he nodded, his cool effrontery superb. "I'm just reminding you what happened to me once before, while I was waiting here at the Lazy Mare for you at night. Shot at and chased plumb to New Mexico by the sheriff. I just wasn't taking no more chances for you or nobody." Pat chuckled for a brief, explosive snort. "Well, I'll concede that one. Just don't let her happen again," he drawled. He paused and went on. "Was there something you wanted?" It was Salone's turn to show annoyance. "Dang it, there you go," he exclaimed. "Was there something I wanted? I'm blamed if I know why I bothered to show any interest in an ornery old crab like you, Stevens. Hereafter, if you want me to stay away altogether, I darn will." He seemed in deadly earnest, but knowing his chunky friend to the core, Pat only shrugged. "Come or go as you like," he said unfeelingly. "You do, anyways." Sam's showery indignation was not proof against this kind of shrewd raillery. His grin flashed out again. "Oh, you pegged me that time, boy. But where in Tunket have you been all this while, Pat? If it's not a closely guarded secret, that is. Pat's head shake was a minute. It's no damn secret. 6 or 8 head of lazy mare stock disappeared again, Sam. That's the 3rd time this month. I tried tracking 'em, started this morning at daybreak, but it's the same old story once more. No such luck. He shoved the coffee pot forward and chucked the stove as he spoke, and then set out a brace of heavy china cups. Seating themselves, they looked at each other gravely over the lamp. You lost their sign, huh? Pat brushed aside an imaginary gnat with evident irritation. Well, it's not from lack of trying, he said grimly. Whoever's been working on my herd is a pretty smooth article. Sloane nodded thoughtfully. I don't know who it could be, neither, he murmured. You ain't spotted no one prowling around the spread, have you? Stephen's even teeth showed briefly in his clean-cut bronze face. Nobody but you. Ignoring the other's levity, Sam rasped his blue stubbled jaw noisily in the heavy quiet. There ain't been a stranger come into Powder Valley since what's-his-name, that young Morgan fella that moved on to the Starcross place over there in them hills. His glance lifted sharply to Pat's face. You don't reckon it could be him, do you? Pat delayed his answer. It was not in his nature to do any wild guessing at such a time. Moreover, what little he knew of Ray Morgan, the blue-eyed redhead who had leased this little Starcross a few months ago and had since striven single-handedly to build up a paying spread, seemed largely to be all in the energetic young feller's favor. Precisely the impression aimed at by any man with crooked intentions, of course. Frowning over his thoughts, Pat shook his head. I don't know what to say yet, he muttered. Haven't been able to boil the signs down till they point unmistakably at any one man. You ever talk to Morgan? Sam persisted. Stevens nodded. Oh, he said howdy, and he struck me as being fairly keen. Whether he's clever enough for this kind of work, that's another story. Sipping their coffee, they talked it over at length. Part owner of a thriving horse ranch down the valley and full-time mentor and guardian of Pat Stevens, in his own eyes, of course, Sloane showed a lively concern for his younger friend's fortunes. Although at any time during the past few years, Pat could have bought him out and his partner twice over. It's dang queer you ain't been able to trace them steers beyond your own range, Sam declared. Not once, but 3 times in a row. Skepticism edged into his voice. Pat made another impatient gesture. Every time they've been drifting over towards the Malpause area below China Springs, he explained. And you know what that is. Every horseshoe won't make a scratch over there. I've spent my time trying to discover where they come out. China Springs, eh? Salone's gaze was shrewd. Well, that ain't too far from Morgan's Starcross. Ever think of that? Pat spread his hands. Oh, I've thought of it, sure, but it's the facts that I'm after, Sam. They gave up a little after an hour, with Sloane still arguing warmly with energetic action, no matter what. At Pat's suggestion, because of the hour's lateness, Sam rolled into an extra bunk and stayed for the night. They awoke early to the sound of Krusty Hodge banging the breakfast utensils about on the stove. A grumpy, taciturn pinion-knot of a man, unquestionably faithful to his keep, Hodge had not lain in his blankets after 5 in the morning, or done a good hour's work during the day, in years. Pat tolerated his faults of all the largeness of his nature, and Krusty silently repaid him with a grudgingly respect which he accorded to no other man on earth. "Why can't you sleep till a decent hour?" growled Sloane, rumpling his tousled hair and knuckling his eyes as he entered into the lamp-lit kitchen.
"We get up in the morning here, and if you don't like it, you just go on home and stay there," Krusty snarled at him.
Pat laughed heartily, standing in the kitchen door behind Sam. "Well, that ought to hold you till breakfast," he told the latter. Sam stumbled outside, muttering something that sounded like "danged old fossil," and they heard him snorting and blowing as he washed up in the basin outside the door. A moment later, his voice rose afresh in trunculate argument, and Pat glid to the opening for a new look. A lanky, broad-shouldered man sat his bronc in the yard. Gaunt of features, his auburn hair grizzled, he had lost none of the fierce energy in the introvert youth. He glared out of his single eye as if Sam was his worst enemy. "Oh, don't give no song and dance," he roared, piercing the little man with a look of blistering accusation. "Why didn't you come home last night, where you belong?" It was Ezra, Salone's partner in the little bar-y-esque horse spread, and by no means a bad man to have on one's back.
"Oh, just go on up in the wash, you old crow," Sam bawled with cheerful energy. "Never occurred to you I might enjoy a night away from your old nagging tongue, huh? Well, I did, and here I am."
"Come on down, Ezra, and come on in." Pat broke through their bickering with scant ceremony. "You're just in time for breakfast. Maybe a bite or two that'll sweeten Sam's disposition." "I'll need some help to wring some sense out of him," Ezra muttered, sliding out of the saddle and striding forward. Sitting down shortly to a generous meal, the big man listened with interest to Pat's description of the rustling. If he showed no surprise, it was because he had learned to look for the unexpected during the devilish course of a rough-and-tumble experience. "The China Springs Malpass, huh?" He pondered the meager fact soberly. "We'll ride out there this morning for a look around. Seems like something can be done." His matter-of-fact assumption that little, if anything at all, had yet been done would have been ludicrous but for the fact that, despite the handicap of his eyesight, Ezra was by far the best tracker they had ever known, and certainly the peer of any of this section in the West. "It'd be appreciated," Pat assured him simply. "I've done all I'm able to, and I'm up against a blank wall." Accordingly, the trio pulled away from the lazy mare on fresh broncs just as the sun broke over the eastern hills, dispelling the crisp chill of the early fall night. An hour jog brought them to China Springs on the western fringe of Stephen's extensive holdings, and here Ezra motioned the others back while he had a deliberate look about.
"What do you make of it, Ezra?"
called Sam after a bit of a delay. The lanky man's answer took the form of a counter-query. "You been grazing stuff in here recent, Stevens?" he demanded. Pat shook his head. "Just happens I haven't needed this grass this season. Why you ask?" he replied. "It seems that 8 or 10 head have watered here lately," returned Ezra. "Some hombre was handling them. I can see the marks of his bronc."
Well, what do we want to know is which way he went from here," interjected Salone dryly.
Ezra slanted a brief, ugly glance in Sam's direction, but offered no rejoinder. He went on casting about, his maneuvers taking him gradually towards the south, and in a short time he had worked a considerable distance away.
"Where are you going? The spring's way over here," Sam barked at him testily.
"You want me to track them steers, don't you?" Ezra snapped. "Well, that's what I'm doing." Following at a little distance, Salone stared down at the rocky ground with amazed incredulous.
"You mean to say you're reading sign here? I don't see a thing."
"You can't?" Ezra's sarcasm was immense. Maybe it's a good thing that I'm doing this instead of you. It was plain to Pat, as time passed, that the one-eyed giant had caught a warm scent. The way led through a tangled maze of ragged lava, which it seemed impossible that any trail could be picked up. Often Ezra had admitted at fault, but he patiently puzzled out the faint trail. Steadily he worked towards the southern border on the rugged Malpas. Seeing how matters went, Pat circled and drifted ahead, working back and forth through the mesquite beyond the rocks. 10 minutes later, the partners heard his hail. "Hey, Ezra, we brought him up this far," Pat called. Ezra and Sam hurried forward and joined him. The former's sharp scrutiny picked up the plain imprints of hoofs winding through the brush, and he nodded. "You ought to be able to cinch it from here out." They followed the trail of the steers more rapidly now. From time to time, as they advanced, Sam lifted his gaze for a shrewd scrutiny of their surroundings. It was not yet midday when Stevens heard the little man's soft snort of discovery. "Is that so?" Sam exclaimed triumphantly. "Notice where they're heading now, don't you, Pat?" "You mean?" Sam's nod was grin. "Straight for young Morgan's Star Cross," he affirmed. "I bet to catch 'em on about half-hour ago, now I'm sure." He pointed significantly across the brushy swells where, almost directly ahead of them, a clump of cottonwoods marked the location of the little Star Cross ranch, its buildings grouped in a shallow cup of hills. Pat's lingering glance in that direction was speculative and thoughtful. "Well, it certainly looks," he began colorlessly, only to break off abruptly. "Stick with the trail, you two," he told the others then. "I'll jog on ahead. There's a slim chance I may catch Ray Morgan at home." Lifting his reins, he cruised forward, making directly for Morgan's place. As he neared the cottonwoods minutes later, he veered so as to keep cover between himself and the clapboard ranch house, meanwhile scrutinizing the yard with care. No sign of life met his eye. Still, he moved forward. Anyone working about the place, at least on the sharp lookout for just at least a visit, would have been caught unaware as Pat single-footed into the yard from behind a shed. But there was no one around to notice his arrival. The place appeared singularly deserted, almost abandoned, without even a nondescript dog to raise a mild clamor. Pat was sitting still in his saddle, a doubtful look on his face, when he caught sight of Ezra and Sam working their way close. They did not advance directly, but forged on through the thin brush, and Pat rode out to join them, and they met a few yards away from Morgan's pole corral. "Stevens, here's where them steers went." Ezra stabbed a gnarled finger bluntly at the corral. "Ain't no doubt about it." Pat shrugged. "If my lazy mare's stuff landed here, it was only a way station," he observed. "There's still work to do, Ezra." They could not doubt what he meant, for the corral was empty. Ezra only turned away, proceeding to cast around the spot. A few minutes later he was off on a new track, working steadily towards the hills. Without comment, he led the way rapidly, scarcely seeming to study the ground as he followed the plain trail of the little bunch of steers. The mesquite thinned as they climbed, giving place to scattered buffalo grass. Gradually the range grew thicker. As Pat expected, the time came when the tracks they were following merged with those of other steers until the lanky tracker was forced to haul up, and scratching his head in bafflement. "End of the line, Ezra?" asked Pat quietly. The big fellow was stubborn. "Not much. No sense quitting after coming this far." Well, it seems that any number of canyons around here where a handful of beeves could hide. We'll have to look around, Pat remarked. It was well they did so. Not 20 minutes later, Sam's rolling whoop brought the others on a run to where he sat his bronc atop of a crumbling cut bank. Pat gazed over and down. Below in the wash, heads nodding as they rested out the noonday warmth in the sun, were 8 brindled steers, all 2 or 3 years old, fat and prosperous, and all wearing Pat's familiar lazy mare brand on their flanks. "Well, there's your stock, Stevens," Ezra exclaimed in a pleased tone. "I reckon that settles it." For a space, however, Pat neglected to speak, his mind already probing far beyond this point. The fact that the steers were still grouped in a close bunch so far away from their home range was glaring proof that they had been rustled. But how far beyond that had they gotten? Sam read his thought. "So soft-hearted Stevens," was his caustic jab. "Even now you hate to break down and admit to yourself that's young Morgan's a crook." "I'd hate to come to any conclusion with any man," Pat returned stubbornly. "Not that I'd hesitate a second once I'm dead sure." "What in creation more do you want?" challenged Sam hotly. "Tracking the stuff right down to Morgan's doorstep, wasn't we? We still had to hide out on his range. Dang it all!" "Hold on, Sam." Stephen's tone was level. "You know the law on rustling. Lest you grab a man red-handed, branding or driving stolen stock, you haven't proved guilty. This looks bad, I'll give you that, but I'm still not sold on Ray Morgan's part in this business." He lifted an admonishing hand as the crusty partners both attempted to speak at once. "Not a word now. I'll play this hand my own way. You'll two play it the same or not at all. Sorry, but that's how it's going to be done." End of chapter 1.